On a quiet Thursday morning, Emily wandered through the neighborhood in Brooklyn where she had grown up. She moved at a slow pace, her hands tucked in the pockets of her faded jacket, letting her mind drift through memories wrapped up in every detail around her. The cracked sidewalks and old brick row houses still looked the same as when she was a kid playing tag with her brothers, and it sometimes felt like time had gently folded back on itself in these narrow streets. Today, Emily wore loose jeans and a simple grey sweatshirt, hoping to blend into the background. Just another face in the crowd, beginning to fill up the city for another workday. The air was crisp, and the golden morning sun touched the tops of the stoops. Emily paused for a moment outside her favorite deli, thinking about maybe grabbing a coffee, when a low humming noise started to grow behind her. She glanced over her shoulder just as two NYPD patrol cars slowed and pulled up along the curb. The sound of tires on old asphalt broke the peaceful bubble she had been in, and the lazy calm of the morning scattered in an instant. Two officers stepped out. One, a tall man with sharp eyes, moved with a certain tension, almost as though he had already decided how the next few minutes would unfold. His hand hovered a little too close to the holster at his waist, an unnerving gesture that made Emily's heart give a small lurch. The other officer kept his gaze fixed not on Emily herself, but somewhere just past her, as if she were part of a blurry background he was trained to be suspicious of. "Excuse me, ma'am, can we talk to you for a moment?" The taller officer called out, his tone clipped and cold, each word feeling like it was meant to pin her in place. Emily barely had time to answer. For a second, all she could think about was how easily you could fade into your old streets, but how quickly you could be yanked into the spotlight by someone else's suspicion. In that moment, she realized that while so much of her past carried respect and comfort, just one encounter could flip everything, making her feel like an outsider, in the very place she still called home. The quiet that had filled those streets not even 15 minutes ago now seemed a memory pushed away by the harsh presence of uniforms and rigid authority. Emily was caught off guard by how suddenly everything shifted. She did not understand, right away, why the officers were speaking to her, but she could feel the weight of their authority pressing down with no clear reason. There was no shout, no loud accusation, just cold professionalism that created its own kind of threat. It became obvious to her that this was not about anything she had done. The questions came sharp and fast. "Can we see your ID?" The taller officer insisted, now with a tone that left no room for refusal. Emily fumbled for her worn wallet, pulling out her state ID and showing it to them, all while balancing the small paper bag from the bakery and a thick book of essays she was planning to finish over coffee. Her hands remained steady, even though inside, her pulse drummed against her skin. There was nothing to hide, nothing suspicious about her, but they looked at her things, then at her face, as if searching for clues to some hidden threat. "Why are you in this area? Where are you coming from? Where are you headed?" Officer Miller, the name flashed on his badge, fired off the questions. Emily answered simply and quietly, not volunteering more than was asked. "I grew up just a few blocks from here," she said, her voice level. "I'm just going for breakfast." She could sense their discomfort every time she spoke calmly. Her refusal to get flustered seemed to irritate them more than anything she could have said. There was a tension in the air, thick and almost electric, that felt far more dangerous than whatever the officers were imagining. Even as they tried to uncover something, Emily stood her ground, neither defensive nor afraid, but simply present. The officers were unsettled by her calm, as if they could not match it and did not know how to react when their usual questions failed to shake someone. They examined her documents for what felt like an eternity, shared a few hushed words that Emily could not hear, and glanced down the street as if expecting a reason for this stop to materialize from nowhere. Time stretched out between questions, and for Emily, every second grew heavier. It was clear that all the suspicion hung on nothing more than her presence. The only thing threatening about her, she realized, was that she refused to be intimidated. That quiet confidence, instead of calming the situation, made it more uncomfortable for the two officers, almost like they were afraid to see her as a regular person instead of a problem they needed to solve. Minutes trickled by, each one stretched out longer than the last. Emily stood quietly on the worn sidewalk as the two officers radioed her information back to dispatch and waited for a response. She stayed completely still, not because she was afraid, but because she understood, painfully well, that for people like her, just being present could be enough to trigger suspicion. It was a lesson learned early. Sometimes your existence alone was enough to draw someone's attention, and that attention could turn heavy very fast. The officers exchanged glances as they waited. Emily noticed how the taller one, Officer Miller, tapped his foot with impatience, and the other, Officer Ramirez, kept darting his eyes between her and the passing cars, always on edge. They looked for some reason to escalate things, as if hoping one would appear in her background check. But when the call finally came back over the radio, it brought nothing except a short burst of static. No warrants, no flags, not even a parking ticket. For a second, the only thing left in the space between them was an awkward silence and the faint sound of car engines and distant voices from the bakery. Officer Miller shoved her documents and the worn paperback into her hands, barely looking at her. His partner mumbled a rehearsed warning, "You might want to avoid walking alone in this part of town," his voice layered with what was supposed to sound like concern, but really felt like a veiled threat. Emily looked at them, understanding perfectly well what was being left unsaid. In their eyes, her place here would always be conditional. She tucked her book and her ID away and watched them get back into their patrol cars, their faces set in frustrated lines. Every piece of the exchange felt like it had chipped away at something inside her, making familiar streets feel not quite as welcoming. Emily realized that even in the neighborhood where she had carved out so many memories, birthday block parties, fire hydrants spraying into the summer air, neighbors helping with groceries, there was no guarantee of safety if someone decided to only see a profile instead of a whole person. As the officers' cars pulled away and the noise of the street returned, Emily took a deep breath. She knew she would keep walking those same streets, but now with a sharper edge to her awareness and a reminder that home is not always a shelter when judgment lingers in someone else's eyes. As Emily wandered back through the same streets she once knew by heart, a strange sense of distance grew with every step. These were sidewalks where she had learned to ride her bike, places where neighbors used to wave from their stoops or greet her by name during summer afternoons. Now, as she passed familiar faces, she noticed the difference. People she remembered giving her candy on Halloween or sharing small talk while waiting in line for fresh bagels seemed uncertain now, their smiles replaced by careful glances and tight lips. It was as if some invisible message had made its way around, reshaping the way people saw her. She tried to convince herself that maybe she was imagining things or being too sensitive, but the feeling would not leave. Down on Fulton Street, she entered Rosenfeld's market to grab a few groceries. Years ago, Mrs. Rosenfeld always stood at the counter, eager to catch up about her family or ask about school. This time, the welcome was different. The new clerk, who probably recognized Emily but did not say so, avoided her eyes. Small talk. Felt forced, and every gesture, from handing her change to bagging her bread, was careful and distant, like there was an unspoken rule to keep the interaction brief. Behind her, an older customer pretended to check out the shelves, but really just kept an eye on her, frowning as if Emily's presence alone asked some uncomfortable question. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of hush that trailed her through every aisle. Emily realized that it would not matter if she wore a business suit or walked in with an NYU badge. None of the things she used to believe could shield her from being misunderstood. She could have stayed away, avoided these places where eyes seemed to hold more judgment than welcome, but this was her home. Outside, the quiet that should have been peaceful instead pressed in on her, reminding her just how easily belonging could slip away. Emily glanced at her reflection in the market's window. She saw herself, just as ever, but also saw a stranger, the one they now seemed to treat as an outsider. The invisible walls people built around themselves, out of caution or fear, stood a little taller than they had before. As she made her way back toward her apartment, the neighborhood felt both achingly familiar and heartbreakingly changed, as if every friendly memory now had to compete with the fresh sting of suspicion and loneliness. Trying to hold on to some kind of comfort, Emily decided to visit someone who had always felt a bit like family. Marion, her mother's old friend and the closest thing too, a second mom she'd had growing up. Marion still lived in the same sunlit brownstone on Jefferson Avenue where Emily had spent so many afternoons after school, eating peanut butter sandwiches in the bright kitchen or listening to stories from decades past. Emily hoped that inside these familiar walls she might find the warmth she had been missing on the street. Marion welcomed her with a gentle smile and a firm embrace, the kind that made it feel like nothing outside mattered. For a little while, sitting together at the kitchen table, things almost felt normal. They talked about old neighbors, about Emily's brothers out in Chicago, and about Marion's rose bushes struggling to bloom this spring. Yet beneath all the small talk, there was a quiet concern in Marion's eyes, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. As the afternoon light shifted, their conversation turned softer, almost cautious, as if they both sensed some things were better left unsaid. "It's different now, isn't it?" Marion asked quietly, stirring a second cup of tea. "I mean, things change, we all know that. But I sometimes wonder if coming back ever feels the same after you've been gone a while." Emily nodded, not sure how much to say. There was truth in those words. Leaving and making her own life was supposed to mean she could always come home, but instead it felt like each year away made her more of a visitor than a neighbor. Emily tried not to let the ache show, but Marion seemed to understand anyway. "Don't let anybody make you feel you're an outsider," Marion said gently, reaching across the table. "You've always belonged here, even if it feels different now. Some folks just struggle with change." Emily squeezed her hand, thankful for the reassurance, but quietly aware that even Marion's house did not feel untouched by the passing years. The moments of comfort in that kitchen filled Emily with gratitude, but they also raised tough questions. Could you really return to the place that made you only to find it does not fit anymore? The afternoon with Marion reminded her that memories sometimes weigh heavy, especially when you walk against the quiet expectations of people who never truly left. As she set off back down the front steps, Emily realized that nostalgia did not always heal, and sometimes it left you wondering whether you ever really belonged in the first place. After leaving Marion's, the weight of uneasiness pushed Emily to search for something that would remind her why she once loved her old neighborhood. There was a stubborn part of her that refused to let one strange day rob her of every good memory. So instead of heading straight back to her apartment, she made her way toward PS 22, the elementary school a few blocks over. The brick building looked much smaller than it had when she was a kid, but the playground still had the faded hopscotch painted near the fence and a swing set that squeaked in the wind. For a minute, she stood by the gate and remembered the golden afternoons spent running around with friends, chasing soccer balls, and laughing so hard it hurt. Those memories flickered by, a bittersweet mix of joy and the ache of everything that had changed. Next, she wandered down to the Brooklyn Public Library, the Grand Army Plaza branch, where she'd spent countless weekends curled up in a corner with a stack of books. Emily traced her fingers along the cool stone steps and peered inside the big glass doors. Even though she did not go in, just seeing those familiar rows of shelves and random flyers stuck up on the bulletin board gave her a small sense of comfort. She thought about all she had learned there, how she used to dream of writing her own stories one day, and felt, for a brief moment, proud of the person she had become. To round off her unofficial tour, she walked down the tree-lined block toward the Old City bus stop. She remembered waiting there during high school, sometimes dreading the next math test, but often excited about the future. It was a spot that had once represented possibilities and escape. Waiting there as buses rumbled past, she tried to soak in some of that old optimism. Yet even as Emily tried to recapture those moments, she could not ignore how things had changed around her. Neighbors walked in compact groups on the opposite side of the street, sometimes glancing over as if to double-check who she was. The blue and white NYPD cruiser passed slowly, not once but twice, doors and windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Emily felt exposed, as if her walk down memory lane was being constantly monitored. No one said anything or openly challenged her, but the suspicion hung in the air. She realized it did not matter how many good memories she had. The barriers others placed between her and a sense of belonging remained stubborn. Each step became a reminder that for some people, trust had been replaced by quiet suspicion, and it would take more than nostalgia or personal achievements to break through. Turning the corner past the old post office, Emily spotted two people standing near the newsstand, caught up in a heated, low-voiced argument. She would have kept walking, only vaguely, aware of strangers going about their day, but a single word stopped her in her tracks. Her own name, said a little too loudly to be accidental. The men weren't trying to be subtle. One glanced her way, his eyes cold, while the other just shook his head, as if her very presence in the neighborhood meant something was wrong. They did not bother lowering their voices as she passed by. "That's her, right? Emily Graham. Came back just for trouble, some say." The first man, maybe in his 40s and wearing a Yankees cap, snorted. "Shouldn't expect anything else. Look what's been happening since she showed up again." The second one, arms crossed and sneering, just nodded and muttered something ugly under his breath, something Emily was grateful she couldn't quite catch. She felt that old, sharp anxiety cut through her chest. It was one thing to feel distant stares or polite coldness. Hearing her name twisted up in gossip, spoken with open hostility, pulled her right into the heart of her unease. The words felt less like rumors and more like warnings, and a deeper part of her realized nothing she could say would change their minds. She forced herself not to react, keeping her head high and her step steady, but a heavy ache settled into her shoulders. Worse than the men's accusations, though, was the way the street around them seemed to freeze. A woman coming out of the laundromat hurried past, with her eyes on the sidewalk. Someone else, waiting at the bus stop, watched the scene for a split second, then turned away as if pretending not to notice. Emily recognized the silence for what it was: no one willing to step in, no one willing to say enough. Whether out of fear, agreement, or exhaustion, the quiet of the neighbors felt nearly as crushing as the prejudice itself. Emily realized how lonely it could be to keep quiet when you wanted to scream, or to stay calm when part of you needed someone to take your side. The neighborhood knew how to protect its old wounds, even if it meant siding with those who poked at them. As she kept walking, the truth hit her all over again. The loneliest part of challenging people's labels and assumptions was not just the stares and whispers, it was the silence, thick and heavy, from everyone who chose to look the other way. As Emily kept her pace along the cracked sidewalk, she suddenly caught the sound of sirens approaching. Within minutes, 2 NYPD cruisers screeched to a halt at the intersection of Nostrand and Gates, blocking off the street and grabbing the attention of everyone nearby. In the time it took her to blink, uniformed officers spilled out, their voices sharp and commanding. "Hands where we can see them," an officer barked. Another pointed his weapon in her direction. The air snapped with the kind of tension that made even cars slow down, and the cluster of onlookers freeze in place. Emily's heart hammered in her chest. She was painfully aware of every eye on her, from the teenagers always hanging by the corner deli to the older folks peering from their windows above. The officers spread out, boxing her in. "You in the red jacket! We saw you exchange something. Put your hands against the wall!" shouted one, his words echoing down the block. Emily tried to keep her voice calm, even as her fingers trembled. "I didn't do anything. I haven't exchanged anything with anyone." Still, none of her words seemed to matter. The accusations kept coming, faster and louder, eclipsing anything else. For a split second, Emily thought to argue or explain, but she had already learned that any sudden move or protest only made things worse. Instead, she lifted her chin, quietly complied, and pressed her hands against the cold brick just as told. Officers patted her down, rifled through her pockets, and looked for anything to justify why they had cornered her with such force. Beside the blue and red lights, the reflection of the whole neighborhood was clear in store windows. She saw wide-eyed kids, silent elderly neighbors, and even someone she played stickball with as a child. No one said a word, not even to protest. The growing humiliation. A chill ran through her body, a cold sweat breaking out along her skin. Heat and embarrassment flushed her face, yet her eyes stayed forward and dry. Emily knew this feeling by now. The exposed vulnerability of being, the lesson, the example, in someone else's cautionary tale. She forced herself not to show anger or fear, determined that the least she could do was meet the humiliation with quiet dignity. Under the dreary New York sky, with so many silent witnesses, some who remembered her dashing through these very streets, Emily endured yet another public misunderstanding, her spirit marked but never truly broken, even as the crowd melted away into uneasy silence. Emily barely had a moment to catch her breath before she felt the cold snap of handcuffs around her wrists. One officer gripped her, arm firmly guiding, really shoving her toward the back seat of the cruiser. Through the rush and blur, she heard voices all around. Some came from the crowd, soft, shocked gasps or the shuffling of feet against the concrete, but the ones that hurt most were the comments just a few feet away, tossed between the officers as if she were nothing more than an object. "She fits the profile. Just following protocol," one of them muttered, just loud enough for her and the street to hear. Another snorted, "Bet she thinks she's above the rules." Their laughter was quick and mean, the kind that revealed their sense of power. Officers exchanged casual smirks, trading cheap jokes while closing the door behind her. Sitting in the cramped back seat, the rough edges of the handcuffs bit into her skin. Emily's shoulders ached both from the physical restraint and from the humiliation of being paraded past her own neighbors. The windows were down, either by accident or on purpose, so she could hear the snatches of talk floating in from outside. A few people whispered, their voices a mix of worry and resignation. One teenager she recognized from Marion's house whispered, "Why'd they even grab her?" but got only a shrug in return. For many, this just seemed like another day, another scene. Emily's jaw tightened as the words of the officers echoed in her head. Profile, protocol, as if that explained everything, but she refused to let those words crush her spirit or force her into the box they tried to fit her in. She forced herself to meet each gaze directly, even through the smudged window. Her silence was not just about self-protection. It was a choice. She would not validate their assumptions with anger, nor would she fall apart here, in front of the people who once cheered her across these sidewalks. Between the rough hands, the squeezed wrists, and the weight of accusation, Emily found something to hold on to. Her own quiet strength. Every moment she sat without breaking, every truth she chose to hold back, rather than hand over to their mocking, was a way to keep some dignity. In those minutes, whatever story they told about her, Emily's own story remained hers alone, safe, and waiting for a time when she could finally change the ending. Pressed against the hard vinyl of the back seat, Emily did her best to steady her breathing while the patrol car idled. She glanced at the scratched plexiglass pane and caught the murky reflections of the officers in the front, still talking low and trading glances. Emily knew this space, this tense quiet before the ride to the station, could become dangerous if she let her emotions take over. All her life, she had been taught how quickly things could flip, how even a simple question or frustrated sigh could be twisted into an incident. So she thought carefully. This was not the time for anger, not even a raised voice. Instead, she relied on what she had learned, the importance of silence, the value of a calm mind. For Emily, keeping quiet was not about fear or surrender. It was about choosing the battle she could win and waiting out the storm when every word might become a weapon turned against her. More than once, she had seen how a 20-second misunderstanding could snowball into years of trouble for someone who looked like she did. When the officers finally asked if she had anything to say, Emily kept her answers short. She knew they had to let her make a call, a right, not a favor. Gathering her nerve, she looked the officer in the eye and asked, "I'd like to make my phone call now. That's protocol, right?" At first, the officer just smirked, nudging his partner. "Would you listen to that? She's got her facts straight." He chuckled, sarcasm thick in his voice. But Emily did not rise to the bait. She just waited, patient and firm. When they reluctantly passed her a phone, she spoke clearly, stating her full name and location. She did not beg or plead. Her words were steady, not desperate. "This is Emily Graham. I've been taken in by NYPD at Nostrand. And Gates, please notify my attorney." Even just this brief call, spoken firmly and with purpose, shifted the mood in the car. The laughter faded. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as they realized she knew her rights, that she would not be easy to intimidate. No longer just the silent woman in handcuffs, Emily's calm, measured actions made it clear she could not be pushed around so easily. In that moment, she turned their careless taunts into something else. A warning that she could not be written off or silenced. Not here. Not now. As the phone call ended, Emily could feel a subtle shift in the air. Inside the patrol car, like a change in the weather before a summer storm. She handed the phone back through the narrow slot, keeping her expression steady. The officers, who just a moment before had been so confident and dismissive, now eyed her with something that looked a lot like doubt. The mood grew tense and uncertain, and the car was suddenly very quiet, except for the faint buzz of the police radio. Not even a minute passed before the dispatcher's voice cut sharply through the static, interrupting the awkward silence. "Unit 15-8, hold your position," said the voice, crisp and commanding. "Verify detainee, Emily Graham, confirmed with U.S. Department of Justice clearance. Repeat, subject's credentials have been verified by central authority. Maintain professional conduct, further instructions to follow." The officers' faces drained of color. Whatever jokes they had, they now kept to themselves. The officer in the passenger seat reached slowly for his own radio, his hands noticeably less sure than before. Another voice came through, deeper and unfamiliar, identifying himself as a supervisor from the main precinct. He asked for badge numbers, requested a full rundown of the arrest, and repeated the instruction to treat Emily in accordance with federal protocol. The way he spoke, the sharpness, the expectation that his words would be obeyed, added something heavy to the air. For the first time since this all started, it was Emily who felt in control. The officers darted nervous looks at one another, and then at her. Their previous confidence had completely faded, replaced by something closer to fear. The officer in the driver's seat even cleared his throat before turning around halfway and mumbling, "Is there anything you need, Miss Graham?" It was a different tone, uncertain, respectful, in an uncomfortable way. Emily met his eyes, holding his gaze for a moment before looking away. She knew this reaction was not about care or concern, but something else, a realization that they had made assumptions, and that now those assumptions had put them in a dangerous spot. Their careers might hinge on what happened next. With the radio still spitting out instructions and unfamiliar names, Emily watched the neighborhood outside the window, knowing the balance of power had quietly but completely shifted inside. That patrol car. The crackle of the radio hardly died down before new instructions came, this time more direct and impossible to ignore. "All units, halt immediately. Remain at your current location. Do not leave the vehicle or interact further with the detainee until federal response arrives." The command was so sharp that even the most stubborn officer could only nod and grip the wheel a little tighter. Within minutes, the narrow Brooklyn street filled with a different kind of presence altogether. Black SUVs, their surfaces gleaming and windows impossibly dark, slid into view like a silent procession. They lined up smoothly along Nostrand Avenue, drawing curious eyes from every building and stoop. The sight of these vehicles alone was enough to raise eyebrows and set the neighborhood buzzing, but it was the way they moved, professional, almost choreographed, that really set them apart from the flustered local officers. People in the community, still cautious and silent after what they had witnessed, stood at their windows and doorways, peering out as the scene changed in front of them. The arrival of those federal vehicles seemed to drain the last bit of authority from the local police, who now sat stiff and quiet, barely looking at one another, waiting for the next move. Out of the SUVs stepped a group of agents with crisp suits and easy, practiced confidence. They moved to the patrol car and opened the back door. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if she should expect more of the same, but she quickly realized this was something else entirely. Unlike the earlier officers, these agents greeted her by name, their voices steady and polite. One of them gently unlocked the cuffs, while another explained, "We are here on direct orders. Please step out, Ms. Graham." The agents helped her stand, checking to be sure she was all right and giving her a moment to find her bearings. They did not ask intrusive questions or speak down to her. Instead, their words and actions showed a respect that came not from fear, but from recognition of her history, her service, and her character. As they walked her toward one of the SUVs, Emily noticed the difference in every gesture. These people saw her for her own record, not for the narrow profile others had forced on her. The agents turned only to their own chain of command, never looking for approval from the local officers, who were left standing awkwardly by their cruiser, out of place for the first time all day. All across the street, the shift in power was clear, not just in who stood closest to Emily, but in the way silence fell again, this time filled more with wonder than with fear. Standing on the sidewalk, Emily took a steadying breath while agents created a careful circle of calm around her. The person in charge, a broad-shouldered man with sharp but kind eyes named John Rivera, stepped forward and asked softly, "Miss Graham, are you all right?" Emily nodded once, then caught herself and answered with quiet firmness, "I'm fine, but what happened out here shouldn't happen to anyone." For the first time that day, someone actually listened rather than brushed her off. John encouraged her to share exactly what she had been through, every humiliating word from the officers, every hand that had squeezed her arms too tightly, the sting of their jokes, and the dismissal behind every order. He did not interrupt or hurry her. He gave her space to speak, and then, without glossing over the details or offering an empty apology, he nodded and turned to face the local officers still lingering by the patrol car. "Who was in charge of this stop?" John asked, his voice firm enough to cut through the silence. There was no anger, just authority, an obvious difference from the showy bravado earlier. Emily watched as the officers shuffled, one finally stepping forward and admitting, "That was me, Officer Peters." John wasted no time. "Walk me through your protocol, officer. Be thorough." As Peters recounted the events, his voice faltered, and he kept glancing at his partner as though hoping for backup that never came. The federal team listened closely, their faces showing not the smallest bit of sympathy. "On what grounds did you detain Ms. Graham? Did you confirm her identity before escalating the situation?" The questions came, each one sharper than the last. There was nowhere for the officers to hide from the plain facts. Meanwhile, another agent retrieved security footage from the corner bodega and a nearby traffic camera. They checked timestamps, reviewed audio files, and made notes, treating every moment as a key piece of evidence. John announced, clearly enough for everyone to hear, that the local police were to remain at the scene for an official review. "No one is to alter or leave. There will be a full investigation into this stop, and we won't be ignoring the facts," he said. Emily, standing beside John and the other agents, finally felt the weight of her experience start to shift off her shoulders. For once, she was not the only one carrying the truth. Now everyone had seen it, and for the first time in a long while, she believed it might actually matter. Now standing free on the street, Emily glanced once more at the officers behind her, then took careful steps toward the waiting SUV, arm in arm with John Rivera and his team. Every gesture was firm, deliberate, but not angry. The agents offered the front seat and even a bottle of water, but Emily quietly declined any special treatment. She had what mattered most, her freedom and the knowledge that she had stood her ground. Emily carried herself as someone with absolutely nothing to hide and nothing to prove, letting dignity return to her on her own terms. The door closed behind her, insulating her from the chaos, and the SUV rolled smoothly away from the curb. As they drove, Emily looked out at the familiar city, blocks sliding past. She noticed people on corners, folks clustered near laundromats and neighborhood markets, all watching the federal motorcade speed quietly through Brooklyn in the early dusk. The agent spoke to her kindly, but didn't push for conversation. They gave her space, which she deeply appreciated. Meanwhile, her release and the circumstances surrounding it traveled quickly up the chain of command. At federal buildings across New York City, word raced from one office to the next. Within Organization 2, officials leaned in over their desks as urgent emails and phone calls raced through the system. Some in Organization 3, a government body responsible for oversight, caught wind of the story, and within an hour, messages had reached senior officials who rarely got involved in neighborhood matters. Emily's name came up, not as a victim, but as a respected colleague who had unexpectedly found herself the center of an ugly and public mistake. Inside the SUV, Emily learned from brief, careful updates that higher-ups were reacting. Not all. The news made its way to her yet, but she understood enough. The chain of events had started in her neighborhood, but would now force long-standing hierarchies to reckon with the reality of what had happened. For years, it was easy to believe that status or position offered some kind of shield, but tonight proved otherwise. She saw it in the agents' measured faces and felt it with every mile they drove away from the scene. She was not interested in vengeance or grand statements, just fairness, acknowledgement, and room for change. Emily sat quietly, watching the city she loved and thinking through what might come next. For the first time in days, hope began to edge out anger. As Emily stepped through the glass doors of the Organization 2 headquarters, the mood was nothing like what she had expected. There was no rush of cameras or lines of stiff, nervous staff, just a steady, respectful quiet. Folks she knew from different departments paused what they were doing, nodding in recognition as John Rivera guided her inside. It felt different from any of her past visits. No tight security checks, no hushed whispers. Maybe everyone understood the weight of what had just happened. Within minutes, word reached her direct supervisor, Michael Watson. Michael was a tall man with sleeves usually rolled up, not one for ceremony, and he left a meeting mid-sentence to greet her at the lobby with concern etched on his face. "Emily, come in. Please, just talk," he said, steering her toward a quiet office. The door shut gently behind them, blocking out the low hum of the building. As she sat in the plain chair beside him, Emily finally let herself speak. The words came slowly at first, as she described the stop, the disbelief on the street and the way the officers had treated her, as though her achievements and service could be erased in a single moment. Michael listened without blinking, every line on his face turning downward in sorrow as he pieced it together. He did not just seem surprised, he looked deeply saddened. They both understood, almost without saying it, that this was more than a personal humiliation for Emily. It had cracked open something bigger, something everyone in the room could feel. For too long, people in their field had trusted that good work and honest effort would be enough to keep them safe. This night showed otherwise, and the silence surrounding situations like Emily's had to end. Shaking off his sadness, Michael searched her face for anger or a demand for payback. Instead, Emily set her jaw and spoke clearly. "I am not here for anyone's pity or for some one-time punishment. I want this to mean something more. This can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone coming up behind me. We need real changes, Michael. Not covers, not closed-door apologies." Michael nodded, thinking hard. Emily's resolve filled the office with purpose. In that moment, her quiet courage and clear demand for lasting change started to reshape their small corner of the world, and maybe, she hoped, more corners beyond. It did not take long for the story of what happened to Emily to move well beyond the walls of Organization 2. By sunrise, messages and reports were circulating through police departments, government agencies, and community boards all across New York City. What started as one ugly traffic stop in Brooklyn suddenly felt like a ripple shaking up much bigger waters. Supervisors who had never heard of Emily now found her name at the top of urgent memos. Nobody could ignore the warning, unchecked power, and careless stops could trip up even those with the cleanest records and the highest ranks. It was not the details of the injustice alone that caught people's attention. Emily's calm but determined push for change, her refusal to just let things slide or settle for a private apology, left a bigger mark than anyone expected. In briefings that morning, her name was mentioned as someone who had shown exactly how to challenge broken rules without making herself into just another headline. Over and over, the message was passed along. She got through it with integrity and made sure nobody would forget why it mattered. In their own way, colleagues all over the city felt a little more alert, a little more careful, wondering if they too could stand up the way Emily did. Simultaneously, the internal review began almost instantly. It was not a quiet, slow process. Buried under stacks of paperwork, it happened in real time. The two patrol officers, Scott Peters and Paul McMillan, were immediately placed on leave. Statements like pending investigation made the rounds, but everyone knew that this time there would be no backroom deals or quietly dropped complaints. Higher-ups had seen with their own eyes that it did not matter how many awards or years of service someone had. Any system that lets prejudice and carelessness seep in could hurt the very people sworn to protect it. All across Organization 2, the tension showed. People avoided idle chat by the coffee machines and stuck to their work, but the message hung in the air. If someone like Emily could get pulled aside in broad daylight, it meant nobody was truly above scrutiny, and nobody was immune to being failed by the system. The case brought with it a heavy pause, the kind that forces everyone to take a breath and ask what might be happening day after day, just beyond the range of cameras and reports. In the days that followed, the investigation moved forward with real urgency. Nobody was allowed to brush things aside or bury mistakes under official language. Teams stepped in from different units within Organization 2 to look at every detail. Every radio call, every line of the officers' logs, every small decision that had led up to that moment on Nostrand Avenue. They reviewed why Scott Peters and Paul Macmillan ignored Emily's credentials, which were crystal clear in her wallet, and why they put their faith in vague complaints from a bystander instead of going by proper procedures. Each time they tried to explain, their words ran thin. There was no answer that made sense, not to the investigators, not to the community, and certainly not to Emily. As parts of the process went public, the city started having uncomfortable but necessary conversations. The officers tried to defend themselves, blaming nerves or saying they just followed their gut. But everyone could see hesitancy written on their faces. Many of the higher-ranking supervisors attempted to chalk the whole thing up to poor training. They claimed mistakes happen when people are inexperienced, hoping to take some heat off the department as a whole. But that argument fell apart quickly. Supervisors leading the inquiry stepped in to make it clear. Ignorance was not the root of the problem. It ran deeper than that. People saw what happened to Emily and began to say out loud what some had quietly known for a long time. The real trouble was something built into the way things worked, how people were viewed and judged before they even opened their mouths. It was not just a single mistake, but evidence of judgment colored by old, harmful ideas. Emily herself did not make any speeches or demand drama. She kept to her work and handled questions with the same calm strength she had shown on the street. Her presence, quiet and steady, was sometimes more meaningful than anything she could have said. In meetings, in the hallways, or on calls, she showed the leadership the system had failed to show her. Colleagues, and even a few officials from Organization 3, began to realize that what Emily represented was an example. Respect people for their whole story, not just how they look or what third-hand rumor follows them. That lesson, simple but powerful, slowly started to push its way into policy talks and breakroom debates, challenging everyone to look harder, ask better questions, and remember the real people beneath every uniform and badge. When Emily was invited to an emergency meeting with the top brass of Organization 1, she wore her regular suit and kept her notebook by her side, just as she always did. The meeting room on the 14th floor was filled with people she had only seen at conferences or in passing, faces that rarely looked nervous, but today held a measure of humility. The head of the regional command, a man called Benjamin Harris, stood and offered a formal apology in front of everyone. He took responsibility for what had happened, admitting that the department had let her down. Emily listened, nodding politely, but when it came time for her to speak, she kept her focus on the bigger picture. She said, "I appreciate the apology, but what really matters is what happens after this. I know I was lucky to have a team jump in and help me, but what about the folks who will never have federal agents stepping in? Young people who get stopped just for being in the wrong place, moms walking their kids home, people trying to make a living. For them, apologies won't mean much unless there are real changes." There was a moment of silence. Instead of pushing for punishment or demanding symbolic gestures, Emily offered concrete suggestions. She talked about building better systems for confirming identities before anyone is detained. She asked leaders to look at how tips and complaints are processed, making sure no voice is taken as truth without a fair check. She wanted the whole team to rethink how the word suspect gets tossed around, pointing out how easily it labels and excludes people before any evidence is there. People in the room scribbled notes, and the head of training openly agreed that their workshops and seminars needed a full overhaul. They discussed making scenario-based drills more realistic and requiring new reviews of every tip-off call. Some of the changes seemed small, like wording in memos or steps in checklists, but Emily insisted these details could change lives. She did not raise her voice or push for publicity, but her calm, practical suggestions resonated like ripples through the group. In those quiet exchanges, she showed everyone that courage was not always about making noise or grabbing headlines. Sometimes the real strength came from steady, thoughtful action, choosing to stand up and quietly insist on something better for people who might never get a chance to speak for themselves. As weeks turned into months, the real impact of Emily's actions unfolded, not in headlines or press conferences, but in the slow, steady way things changed behind the scenes. The officers involved, Scott Peters and Paul Macmillan, did not return to their old beats. Instead, they were quietly reassigned to desk duties, handling paperwork far from the street. It was not meant to be a public spectacle, but everyone in law enforcement circles knew what those transfers meant. The message was clear. Actions had consequences now, no matter who was involved. Academies across New York City started using the case as a learning tool in their training sessions. No big announcements gathered crowds, but young officers found themselves sitting through real-life scenarios drawn straight from Emily's experience. The instructors would pause and ask questions like, "How would you handle this if the person in front of you were your own neighbor? What if you ignored their paperwork by mistake?" The conversation shifted from just following the rules to paying attention to the person behind the badge or civilian clothes. People started to see these stories as more than lessons. They became reminders that everyone deserved dignity, no matter how tense or confusing a situation got. Emily, meanwhile, went right back to her regular routine at Organization 2, melting quietly into the background of her team. She kept showing up early, handling cases with the same focus she always had, and giving advice to younger staff when they asked for it. She never bragged or took credit for the ripple effects her calm approach had set off. In meetings and case reviews, her name would sometimes come up as an example of professionalism. Reports noted how she had acted with patience and respect during every step, even when she could have let frustration or anger take the lead. The higher-ups started including her approach in their official guidelines, even if they never said it out loud. The most important changes, though, were impossible to track on paper. Small things, how officers greeted each other, how they handled street complaints, how much effort they put into checking facts, began to look and feel different. The culture itself shifted ever so slightly, like a door quietly opening just enough to let better light in. Emily was not looking for a trophy or a special title. Her legacy took root in those softer, everyday choices made by people who were now just a little more careful, a little more human, and a lot more aware that real change can start with one person doing the right thing when it matters most. Several years slipped by, and Emily's life settled into its usual rhythm. The fuss over her case long faded from daily talk. Yet every so often, her name would spring up in meetings, or her story would be told in training seminars as an example of how to handle difficult moments with integrity. Then one spring, she received a letter asking her to close out a major conference for hundreds of police officers, federal agents, and instructors from all around the country. The event was being held at a spacious conference center just outside Manhattan, filled with rows of seats and a stage that seemed too big for a single speaker. Emily hesitated at first. Public speaking was never her goal. She preferred working quietly, away from spotlights. But after some thought, she agreed, knowing that new generations of officers would be in the audience. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell into a hush. Every face turned her way. She took a slow breath before beginning, her words weaving together old pain with new hope. She began by sharing what happened all those years ago, not just the facts, but what it really felt like to stand on a curb in handcuffs when she had spent her career following the law. Emily was honest. Despite every award, every case I solved, it took only a few seconds of bias to put my name and my life on trial. She did not linger on blaming anyone or carving up old wounds. Instead, she explained how she managed to hold her ground, refusing to let anger take charge, even when she felt utterly powerless. Her voice was steady as she described choosing composure over outrage, dignity over bitterness. Throughout the hall, nobody spoke or checked their phones. The silence showed not just respect for Emily, but for the truth behind her words. She asked everyone there to remember what mattered most, that real justice demanded more than procedures or uniforms. True fairness, she said, meant seeing the person behind the badge or the civilian clothes, to look beyond appearances before making any judgment. When her speech ended, there was a pause before the entire room rose in a standing ovation. She was not looking for praise. What she hoped for was that her story would stick with those men and women, the way a good lesson lingers, quiet but strong, urging each one to carry forward the reminder that justice starts with seeing each other's humanity first.